Long before the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964, America was a very different place. It was a country of great dreams, but also of great divisions. The streets were busy, the cities growing, and people called it the land of the free. But freedom did not feel the same for everyone. If you were an African American living in the southern states, you were not treated as equal, not by the law, not by society, and not even in the simplest parts of daily life. Imagine walking down a street in Alabama or Mississippi in the 1950s. You see two drinking fountains, one marked white, the other colored. You go to a restaurant, but there's a sign on the door, whites only. If you were black, you couldn't eat there. You couldn't sit at the front of the bus. You couldn't go to the same school or use the same bathroom or sleep in the same hotels as white people. These weren't just bad habits, they were the law. They were called the Jim Crow laws, and they existed across much of the South. They told millions of Americans, based on nothing but the color of their skin, where they could live, where they could work, what schools their children could attend, and how they should behave in public. And breaking these laws wasn't a small thing. If a black person drank from the wrong fountain or sat in the wrong seat, they could be arrested, beaten, or even killed. For a young black child growing up in those years, life was full of invisible walls. When they walked to school, they would often pass by beautiful white schools with large playgrounds, buses, and new books. But their own schools were small, underfunded, and old. Books were torn, desks broken, and classrooms overcrowded. Still, parents told their children to study hard, because education, they said, was the only path toward a better future. Even as they studied, they knew that some doors would always stay closed. They could become teachers, preachers, or musicians, but being a doctor, a lawyer, or a government official, that was almost impossible. For adults, life meant constant caution. Every day was a lesson in survival. Black men and women were told to know their place. If they spoke too boldly or stood up for themselves, they could lose their jobs, their homes, or even their lives. In many towns, groups called the Ku Klux Klan, dressed in white robes and hoods, spread terror at night. They burned crosses, set fire to homes, and attacked people who dared to ask for equality. The message was cruel and clear. Stay silent, stay small, stay afraid. But inside every heart, something stronger was growing, a quiet fire, a belief that one day things had to change. It was strange, even painful for many Americans to see their country this way. The same nation that had fought a great civil war to end slavery and had won was now full of laws that still kept black people separate and unequal. The United States had helped defeat Nazi Germany in World War II, fighting for freedom and democracy. Yet, when black soldiers returned home after serving bravely overseas, they still couldn't vote in many states or sit in the same restaurants as white soldiers. The contradiction was heavy. How could a nation that spoke so proudly about liberty deny it to millions of its own people? Yet through all this pain and injustice, African Americans built powerful communities of their own. They built churches that became centers of hope and courage. They created newspapers that told their stories, schools that taught pride, and music that lifted their spirits. It was a way of saying, we are still here. We are still human. We still believe. Families sat together at dinner tables and prayed for better days. Children heard their parents whisper stories of freedom, courage, and hope. Names like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, heroes from another time who had fought for liberty. And slowly, the idea began to return. Maybe it was time to fight again. The 1950s were a time of great change in the world. Technology was advancing, television was entering homes, and new ideas were spreading faster than ever before. People could now see what was happening in other parts of the country, and it opened their eyes. White Americans who had never witnessed segregation before were now seeing images on TV of peaceful black protesters being beaten, fire-hosed, and arrested simply for asking for basic rights. The world was watching too. The United States claimed to be the leader of the free world during the Cold War, but how could it preach freedom abroad while practicing racism at home? The pressure was building, from inside and out. Something had to give. Change often begins quietly, not with loud speeches or grand marches, but with simple, everyday acts of courage. In 1954, a young girl named Linda Brown from Topeka, Kansas, wanted to go to a school near her home, but she wasn't allowed because she was black. Her father, Oliver Brown, challenged this unfair rule in court, and the case, Brown v. Board of Education, reached the U.S. Supreme Court. That year, the court made a historic decision. Racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Separate was not equal. It was a moment of hope. Many believed it was the beginning of a new era. But in many southern states, the decision was met with anger. Governors refused to obey. Schools were shut down. White parents protested. And so, even though the law had spoken, change still came slowly and painfully. All across America, new voices began to rise. Black leaders, preachers, and students started organizing. They formed small groups to discuss freedom and equality. They learned about peaceful resistance, the same kind that Mahatma Gandhi had used in India. In churches, basements, and schoolyards, people prayed, sang, and planned. They were ready to challenge an unjust system, not with violence, but with peace, not with hatred, but with love and courage. By the late 1950s, the tension was everywhere. The country stood on the edge of something big, a movement that would change not only laws, but hearts. In Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks was about to take her seat on a bus and, without knowing it, start a revolution. But before her moment, before the marches and speeches and songs, there was this: a country divided by color, a people weighed down by injustice, and a dream waiting to be born. America was a land full of contradictions, of freedom and fear, of promise and pain. But deep within that division, a spark of hope had already been lit. It was the hope that one day every person, no matter their color, could walk into any restaurant, any school, or any bus and be treated simply as a human being. That dream, quiet but powerful, was about to rise, louder than ever before. Every great change begins with a single act of courage. Sometimes it's not loud or dramatic. Sometimes it begins in the quietest of ways, with one person who decides that enough is enough. It was a cold evening in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1, 1955. The buses were full of tired workers heading home after a long day. Among them sat a seamstress, a quiet, dignified woman named Rosa Parks. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, but that evening she made a choice that would shake the world. Rosa had finished a long day sewing clothes at a department store. Her feet ached as she climbed onto the bus and took a seat in the section reserved for black passengers, near the middle. As the bus moved, more white passengers got on. Soon there were no empty seats in the white section. The bus driver, following the cruel laws of segregation, turned and said, "Y'all better make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats." The black passengers in Rosa's row hesitated. One by one, the others stood up, but Rosa stayed seated. Calmly, firmly, she said, "No." She wasn't shouting. She wasn't angry. She was simply tired of being treated as less than human. The driver called the police. Rosa Parks was arrested. But that single moment, a woman refusing to give up her seat became a spark that ignited a movement. When news of Rosa's arrest spread through the community, people were outraged, but also inspired. A young preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., only 26 years old at the time, stepped forward to help lead the response. The black community of Montgomery decided to do something bold, something peaceful but powerful. They would stop riding the buses. For over a year, 381 days to be exact, thousands of black men and women walked to work, to school, to church, and back home. Some walked miles every day in the rain, in the cold, and in the heat, but they refused to give in. Empty buses rolled down the streets of Montgomery, costing the bus company thousands of dollars. White officials tried to break their spirit, threatening, jailing, and intimidating protesters, but the people stood firm. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The boycott ended, and the people won. It was a victory not just for Montgomery, but for the entire country. It proved that peaceful resistance could change unjust laws. Out of that struggle rose a new voice, calm yet powerful, loving yet unyielding, the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke of justice through peace, of love in the face of hate, of nonviolence as the greatest weapon of the oppressed. His words moved people's hearts. We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. He preached that real change could only come through courage, discipline, and faith, not anger or revenge. King became the symbol of a new kind of leadership, one built not on fear or violence, but on unity and hope. As Dr. King's message spread, others began to follow. In city after city, young people took up the call for freedom. In 1960, 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in a store called Woolworth's. They politely asked for coffee and were refused. They didn't shout. They didn't leave. They simply stayed. Day after day, more students joined them, sitting silently while white customers cursed, spat, and poured drinks on them. The police came. The students were arrested. But they kept coming back, sitting, waiting, refusing to be moved. These became known as the sit-ins, and they spread like wildfire across the South. From Tennessee to Virginia, from Georgia to Texas, thousands of students took part. Their quiet bravery showed the world the strength of peaceful protest and the ugliness of racism. Soon after, in 1961, another group of activists, both black and white, called themselves the Freedom Riders. They decided to test the Supreme Court's ruling that outlawed segregation in interstate travel. They boarded buses traveling from Washington, D.C. into the Deep South. But as those buses rolled into Alabama and Mississippi, they were met with violence. Mobs attacked them. One bus was set on fire. Riders were beaten and jailed. Still, they didn't stop. Their courage caught the attention of the world and forced the federal government to finally enforce the law. By the early 1960s, the movement was growing stronger every day. Churches became command centers of hope. Students, workers, and families filled the streets, holding signs, singing hymns, and marching for justice. The songs they sang were full of faith and defiance. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. They didn't have weapons. They didn't have power, but they had something far greater, the moral force of truth and the courage to stand up peacefully, no matter the cost. In Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most segregated cities in America, activists decided to take an extraordinary step. They invited children, some as young as 6, to march for freedom. Thousands of school kids filled the streets, singing and chanting for equality. Police unleashed fire hoses and dogs on them. Television cameras captured the horrific scenes. Children knocked to the ground by powerful jets of water, others dragged away to jail. The world watched in shock and horror. Those images shook the conscience of a nation. Birmingham became a turning point, a moment when even people who had stayed silent began to say, "This has to stop." Dr. King's message was spreading across the country, echoing in homes, churches, and schools. He said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." More and more Americans of all colors began to see the truth, that the fight for civil rights was not a black problem. It was an American problem, one that touched the soul of the entire nation. In 1963, Dr. King and other leaders began planning something historic, a march that would bring hundreds of thousands of people to the capital of the United States. They called it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The movement that began with a single woman on a bus had now grown into a force that could not be ignored. From quiet living rooms to crowded church halls, from classrooms to cotton fields, the message was the same: freedom now. As the summer of 1963 approached, the nation's capital prepared for a day that would change history. People from every corner of the country, black and white, young and old, packed their bags and began their journeys to Washington, D.C. They came not to fight, but to stand. Not to destroy, but to dream. The spark of courage that Rosa Parks lit had become a blazing fire, spreading across hearts, across cities, across generations. And soon, on a bright summer morning, the world would hear that dream spoken aloud, in a voice that still echoes to this day. The time for silence was over. The time for action had come, and the dream of equality was ready to be shared with the world. By 1963, the fire of the civil rights movement was burning across America. It had started with one woman on a bus. It had spread through cities, churches, schools, and streets. And now it was about to reach the very heart of the nation, Washington, D.C. The time had come to show the world that this fight was not about anger or revenge. It was about hope, about love, about a simple dream that all people, no matter the color of their skin, deserved to be treated as equals. It was the summer of 1963, hot, restless, and full of anticipation. Across the country, civil rights leaders were planning something never seen before, a peaceful march on the capital city. They called it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It wasn't just about race. It was about dignity, about work, about the right to live without fear or humiliation. Organizers like Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, and Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to show that America's conscience was awake, that millions were ready to stand together. Many were afraid. Some said it would end in chaos. Others feared violence. But the leaders knew the truth, that peace, not anger, would carry their message further than any weapon ever could. From every corner of the nation, people began to travel. Buses rolled from Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. Trains carried workers and students from New York, Chicago, and Detroit. Families packed sandwiches, water, and signs that read, "We demand equal rights now, jobs and freedom for all. I am a man." Some people had never left their towns before. Others risked their jobs or safety to attend. But they came because they believed in something greater than fear. On August 28, 1963, the sun rose over the nation's capital. And by morning, more than 250,000 people, black, white, old, young, gathered near the Lincoln Memorial. It was the largest peaceful protest in American history. The air was filled with music, laughter, and prayer. Strangers hugged each other. People sang spirituals, gospel songs, and chants of freedom. On that day, dozens of speakers took the stage. They spoke about jobs, justice, and the promise of democracy. There were singers like Mahalia Jackson, whose powerful voice filled the air with faith. There were union leaders, rabbis, priests, and students, all united by one cause. They spoke beneath the statue of Abraham Lincoln, the man who had freed the slaves a century earlier. But even after 100 years, freedom was still unfinished business. Then, near the end of the day, a young preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, stepped up to the podium. He had already become known across the country for his courage and his calm. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The crowd quieted. The air seemed to still. King began to speak slowly, his voice deep and clear. He said, "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation." He spoke of the struggles that Black Americans still faced: poverty, police brutality, and broken promises. He reminded everyone that even after 100 years, freedom had not yet been delivered. And then, as he neared the end, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out from behind him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Dr. King paused, looked out over the crowd, and began to speak from his heart, words that would echo through generations. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today." The crowd erupted in cheers and tears. People held hands, hugged, and cried openly. It was more than a speech. It was a vision of the world as it should be. A world of compassion, not cruelty. A world of fairness, not fear. A world where humanity came before hatred. Television cameras captured every word. Millions watched from their living rooms. For the first time, America saw not a riot, not a rebellion, but a peaceful army of dreamers. They saw mothers holding babies, students waving flags, preachers praying, and ordinary people standing shoulder to shoulder, singing of freedom. The world was watching too. From London to Lagos, from India to South Africa, newspapers printed King's words. People who had never even seen America felt inspired, because his dream was not just for one nation, it was for humanity. President John F. Kennedy watched the march from the White House. He had been cautious about civil rights, careful not to move too fast. But when he saw the unity and dignity of the marchers, something changed. Later that day, Kennedy met with Dr. King and other leaders. He told them their cause was right and promised to push for a new civil rights bill. He said, "The cause of equality must be America's cause." The march had done more than make history. It had moved hearts in the highest places of power. For a moment, it felt like the dawn of a new era. The march had proven that peace was stronger than hate, that unity could silence centuries of division. But even as the movement celebrated, dark clouds were gathering. Just weeks later, on September 15, 1963, tragedy struck in Birmingham, Alabama. A church, the 16th Street Baptist Church, was bombed by white supremacists. 4 little girls, dressed in their Sunday best, were killed. The nation mourned. The world wept. The dream had been spoken, but the struggle was far from over. In the months that followed, violence increased. Marchers were beaten. Activists were jailed. Dr. King's home was bombed. And yet, the movement did not stop. Every attack only strengthened their resolve. because they knew that injustice, once seen, could no longer be ignored. Television screens showed peaceful protesters being dragged by police, bitten by dogs, and sprayed with fire hoses. Americans who had once stayed silent began to ask, "Is this who we are?" The dream was not just about laws, it was about the soul of a nation. The March on Washington had changed everything. It pushed the issue of civil rights from the sidewalks to the halls of Congress. President Kennedy began drafting a bill that would outlaw segregation and discrimination. But before he could see it passed, tragedy struck again. On November 22, 1963, while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The nation was in shock. The dreamer who had promised change was gone. But his promise would not die with him. His successor, President Lyndon B. took up the cause, determined to turn that dream into law. Even in grief, the movement pressed forward. They knew that if they gave up now, everything, all the marches, all the tears, all the courage, would have been for nothing. Dr. King told his followers, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It was faith, not anger, that kept them walking. Faith that love could heal that hate had broken. Faith that one day the laws of man would finally match the laws of the heart. The March on Washington had shown what was possible when people stood together in peace. It had given America a glimpse of its better self, the country it could be. But the road ahead would be long and hard. There would be more marches, more pain, and more sacrifice before that dream could take root in the law. Yet something had changed forever. The movement was no longer a whisper in the South. It was a roar across the nation. And in every classroom, every church, and every family that saw those brave souls standing together, a question began to form. If they can risk everything for freedom, what am I doing for justice? The march was over, but the dream was alive, carried in the hearts of millions, marching toward the day when freedom would not be a dream, but a promise fulfilled. Dreams are powerful, but every dream that changes the world must walk through a valley of pain. After the March on Washington, the nation was inspired, but also divided. Many cheered the movement for peace, but others, especially in the Deep South, felt threatened. They saw the march not as hope, but as rebellion, and they were ready to fight back. Every step toward equality seemed to awaken new waves of hatred. Churches that hosted civil rights meetings were bombed. Activists were beaten, jailed, and sometimes killed. In Mississippi, a young man named Medgar Evers, a father, veteran, and field secretary for the NAACP, had spent years fighting to register black voters. He spoke out, even when it meant danger. One night, as he stepped out of his car, carrying T-shirts that read, "Jim Crow must go," he was shot in the back in front of his own home. His children ran outside, crying. He died before reaching the hospital. His death sent shockwaves across the country. He became one of many martyrs whose courage lit the path forward. Then came the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, just weeks after the March on Washington. It was a Sunday morning. Children were getting ready for church service. Laughter echoed through the hallways. And then, an explosion. The walls collapsed, the stained glass shattered. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were killed instantly. The bombing was carried out by white supremacists angry at the growing civil rights movement. The images of tiny shoes, broken pews, and grieving mothers filled newspapers around the world. Even people who had ignored the movement before could no longer look away. The cruelty was too much to bear. America was beginning to ask itself, how can such hate exist in a land that calls itself free? Meanwhile, in the Deep South, one of the most important battles was being fought, the right to vote. In many states, Black Americans were still denied that right through impossible literacy tests, poll taxes, and pure intimidation. In some counties, not a single Black person was registered, even though they made up the majority of the population. But brave organizers refused to give up. They went door to door teaching people how to register, how to fill out forms, and how to stand up to fear. Their courage would later lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations in American history, the Selma Marches. But before that moment would come, another tragedy would shake the entire nation. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy rode through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Crowds lined the sidewalks, waving and smiling. He had spoken of a future where civil rights would finally be secured. He had promised a new law that would make discrimination illegal. But that promise was cut short by a single gunshot. Kennedy was assassinated, killed instantly as his car passed through Dealey Plaza. The world froze in disbelief. Millions watched on television as news anchors broke down in tears. Across the country, people wept openly, Black and white alike, because Kennedy, for all his caution, had become a symbol of hope for equality. Now that hope seemed uncertain again. After Kennedy's death, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One. He was a Southerner, born and raised in Texas, and many wondered whether he would continue Kennedy's path on civil rights. But Johnson surprised the nation. In his first speech to Congress, he said, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought." He made it clear the promise would not die. He would fight to pass Kennedy's bill. And so began one of the toughest political battles in American history. The proposed Civil Rights Act aimed to outlaw segregation in public places, schools, restaurants, buses, and more. It would also make discrimination illegal in employment. But not everyone agreed. Many Southern senators were determined to stop it at any cost. They launched what's known as a filibuster, a tactic to block a vote by speaking endlessly. For 83 days, senators took turns talking, reading from books, and stalling the bill. One senator even read recipes and phone books aloud just to waste time. But outside Congress, the nation was changing. The images of brutality in Birmingham and other cities had opened people's eyes. Public opinion was shifting. The moral weight of the movement was too strong to ignore. While politicians argued in Washington, the streets were still alive with protest. In the South, activists faced daily threats. Freedom riders, teachers, and students were arrested simply for demanding equal rights. In the town of St. Augustine, Florida, Black swimmers jumped into a whites-only hotel pool, a peaceful protest. In response, the hotel manager poured acid into the water to drive them out. The cruelty was shocking, but each act of hate only made the need for change clearer. Photographs of those moments, angry mobs, innocent faces, quiet bravery, appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world. The truth was visible now, and truth is a powerful weapon. As the debate reached its final days, the pressure on Congress was immense. Religious leaders prayed on the Capitol steps. Workers sent letters. Students marched in the streets. Dr. King urged the nation to stay strong and peaceful. He said, "We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force." The movement had faced bombs, beatings, and death, but it had never lost its soul. Finally, on June 10, 1964, the filibuster ended. It was the longest continuous debate in Senate history, and it was over. The Civil Rights Act was ready for a vote. On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson walked into the East Room of the White House. He sat at a desk with over 70 pens laid out in front of him. Beside him stood Dr. King, Rosa Parks, and other civil rights leaders, the men and women who had risked everything to make this day possible. Johnson signed his name slowly, using each pen to mark a single letter. When he finished, he turned to the cameras and said, "We believe that all men are created equal, yet many are denied equal treatment. We cannot expect to be the leader of the free world if we continue to deny freedom to our own citizens." With the stroke of a pen, segregation was no longer legal in the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had become law. Outside the White House, people celebrated, crying, hugging, praying. For the first time in American history, discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin was forbidden by law. Restaurants that once said whites only could no longer turn people away. Employers could no longer refuse to hire someone because of their skin color. Schools could no longer separate children by race. It was a giant step toward justice. But even as the ink dried on the page, Dr. King reminded everyone, "The law can't make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important." The law had changed, but hearts still needed to follow. From Rosa Parks' quiet defiance on a Montgomery bus, to the marches, the jail cells, the songs, the tears, to the president's signature in the East Room, this journey had cost blood, sweat, and countless lives. But it proved something eternal, that courage and unity can overcome the darkest hatred. As night fell over Washington that July evening, many who had marched, suffered, and prayed sat quietly in their homes whispering, "We did it." But deep down, they knew the fight was not over. The Civil Rights Act was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test whether America could truly live up to its promise. The dream had survived the fire, but the road to freedom stretched onward, through Selma, through sacrifice, through generations yet to come. The struggle had changed laws. Now it would have to change hearts. July 2, 1964, a warm summer evening in Washington, D.C. Inside the White House, the air was heavy with history. President Lyndon B. Johnson sat at his desk, surrounded by leaders of the civil rights movement, men and women who had marched, prayed, and suffered for this very day. He reached for a pen, and with slow, deliberate strokes, he signed his name, not once, but with over 70 pens, each one destined to become a symbol of freedom. As cameras flashed, he spoke softly but firmly. "We have just now passed a law that will strike down the last strongholds of discrimination in this country." It was official. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was now the law of the land. But what exactly did this new law mean? What did it promise? And to whom? For many, it was hard to believe. For decades, segregation had been part of everyday life. Now, with a single law, the walls were supposed to fall. The Civil Rights Act had 11 titles, or sections, each targeting a different kind of injustice. Title II made it illegal for restaurants, hotels, theaters, and other public places to refuse service based on race, color, religion, or national origin. No more whites-only signs. No more separate water fountains or waiting rooms. Title III gave the government the power to enforce desegregation in public facilities, parks, libraries, and swimming pools. Title IV attacked segregation in schools. It gave the federal government the authority to help local school districts integrate black and white students, a battle that had begun 10 years earlier with Brown v. Board of Education. Title VI banned discrimination by any program that received federal money, like hospitals, universities, and public transportation. And Title VII, perhaps the most revolutionary of all, banned discrimination in employment, not just by race, but also by religion, sex, or national origin. It created a new agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to enforce it. In short, the law said what should have been true all along. You cannot treat someone as less than human because of the color of their skin. When the law was announced, there were cheers in some places and fury in others. In the North, many celebrated. In the South, resistance burned hot. Some restaurants closed their doors rather than serve black customers. Certain schools defied the law outright. A few governors swore they would never let Washington tell them how to live. But change had begun, and it could not be stopped. In the small towns of Alabama and Georgia, something extraordinary happened the very next day. Black men and women walked into restaurants where they had never been allowed before. Some owners looked nervous. Some customers left. But others, quietly, humbly, stayed and served them. A black teenager named Sarah from Birmingham later said, "The first time I sat down at that counter, I didn't even order anything. I just wanted to sit there and breathe the same air, like everyone else." For her, that simple moment meant freedom. The Civil Rights Act didn't just change laws, it began to change hearts. But progress was slow. School integration, for instance, took years. In many Southern towns, white families withdrew their children from public schools to avoid integration. New private academies were built just to keep segregation alive. Federal marshals were often sent to escort black students to class, a reminder that though the law was written, justice still needed protection. And yet, with every step, the walls of division began to crumble. Young black students who once walked miles to poorly funded schools now sat in bright classrooms beside white classmates. For the first time, children learned together. The first generation to grow up in classrooms where color didn't define worth. The law's reach extended far beyond schools and diners. In offices, factories, and hospitals, new rules came into effect. For decades, job applications quietly excluded people of color. Whites-only signs had hung in store windows and warehouses. Now that was over. A black mechanic in Detroit could no longer be fired because of his skin color. A woman in Texas could no longer be told that men's jobs pay more. For millions of Americans, it was the first time they could dream of real opportunity. But even here, resistance lingered. Employers found new ways to discriminate, silently, subtly. Job interviews would end early. Promotions would mysteriously go to others. The fight for equality, it seemed, had only changed form. It was no longer fought with signs and police dogs, but in boardrooms, schools, and courtrooms. President Johnson knew the battle wasn't over. He had been raised in the South. He understood the pride, the stubbornness, the slow turning of old hearts. He once told his staff, "You can't change the heart of man by law, but you can stop his hands from hurting someone." He believed that while the law couldn't force people to love, it could at least stop them from denying others their basic rights. Behind closed doors, Johnson worked tirelessly. He called governors, met with senators, and personally oversaw the enforcement of the new act. He wanted America to move forward, not just legally, but morally. For Dr. King, the signing of the Civil Rights Act was a triumph, but also a reminder of the work still ahead. He told a crowd in Atlanta, "The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a second emancipation, a new birth of freedom for our nation. But it is only a beginning. The road ahead is long and hard." He knew the next great battle would be for voting rights, because even though the law now said everyone was equal, millions of black Americans still couldn't cast a ballot. In some states, officials continued using unfair tests, impossible questions, and intimidation to keep black people from voting. Without the power to vote, they couldn't choose leaders who would protect their rights. The movement had won one war, but another was already beginning. Still, the change could be felt everywhere. Television, once filled with images of fire hoses and riots, now showed scenes of progress. Students walking together, new jobs opening, friendships crossing racial lines. Black families moved into neighborhoods that had once been closed to them. Young white activists joined in the movement, realizing that equality for one meant freedom for all. In music, art, and culture, a new voice was rising, proud, confident, and free. Soul, gospel, and jazz carried messages of hope. Writers and poets captured the pain of the past and the promise of the future. The world was watching America transform, slowly, painfully, but surely. But not everyone was ready to accept this new world. Violence continued in many southern towns. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan intensified their attacks. In Mississippi, 3 young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Sherner, disappeared while helping register black voters. Weeks later, their bodies were buried in an earthen dam. The tragedy shocked the nation once again, proving that even after the law, hate still lived in the shadows. But each act of cruelty only strengthened the resolve of those fighting for justice. They marched again. They sang again. They refused to be silent. As time passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 began to reshape American life in visible ways. New government programs supported integrated schools. Workplaces adopted anti-discrimination policies. Court cases enforced the new rules and punished those who broke them. It wasn't fast. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By the late 1960s, millions of African Americans were working better jobs, attending better schools, and voting in greater numbers. A new generation was growing up believing that equality was not a dream, but a right. Laws can open doors, but they cannot teach love. They can remove barriers, but they cannot erase prejudice overnight. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a foundation, a legal promise that America would strive to be fair. But true equality would take more than signatures and speeches. It would take patience, courage, and compassion from every citizen. Dr. King once said, "The law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's a pretty important first step." He was right. The law had given America a mirror, forcing it to see its reflection, both beautiful and broken. In the years that followed, other movements rose on the shoulders of the Civil Rights Act. Women demanded equal pay. People with disabilities fought for accessibility. Immigrants, indigenous people, and the LGBTQ community began their own marches for justice. The Civil Rights Act became more than a law. It became a template for fairness, a reminder that progress is possible even when it feels impossible. That evening in 1964, when President Johnson placed his pen on paper, he wasn't just signing a bill. He was signing a promise, one that every generation since has had to keep alive. A promise that no matter how deep the pain of the past, the future can still bend toward justice. The cameras flashed. The crowd applauded. Dr. King smiled quietly, knowing this was not the end, but the beginning of a new journey. The law had been passed. The dream had taken one giant step forward. And though the road ahead was still long, for the first time in centuries, the light of equality had begun to truly shine. The year was 1964, and America was no longer the same. Something had shifted in its laws, in its spirit, and in its conscience. The Civil Rights Act had been signed. The ink was dry. But the story of equality was far from finished. This was not the end of the movement. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a new America, and a new hope. In the days following the signing, people across the country awoke to a world that felt both familiar and brand new. Black families sat around their radios listening to President Johnson's words. In schools, teachers explained what the law meant. In churches, pastors read out loud from newspapers, "Segregation now illegal," and the congregations clapped, shouted, and cried. But many also asked quietly, what happens now? Would hearts change as quickly as the law had? Would people who had once hated now learn to love? Would the promise of equality finally reach every home, every school, every soul? Those were questions time alone could answer. As the celebrations faded, a new challenge rose: voting rights. In many southern states, even after the Civil Rights Act, Black citizens still faced impossible barriers to voting. They were asked to recite the Constitution, pay unfair taxes, or answer absurd questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? If they failed, which they always did, no matter how smart they were denied the right to vote. Without that right, they couldn't change the laws that governed them. They couldn't choose leaders who would protect their freedom. So the marches began again. Led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., activists set out to make the right to vote a reality. They marched through Selma, Alabama, a small town that would soon become a symbol of courage. It was March 7th, 1965, a Sunday morning. 600 peaceful marchers walked toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge. They carried flags, sang hymns, and prayed as they crossed the Alabama River. On the other side, waiting for them were lines of police officers, armed with clubs, tear gas, and horses. As the marchers approached, the police ordered them to stop. They refused. And then, without warning, the officers charged. Tear gas filled the air. Men and women were beaten to the ground. Some crawled, some carried others. The nation watched in horror as television cameras broadcast the brutal scenes. Children and elderly protesters trampled and bleeding on the bridge. It became known as Bloody Sunday. But out of that tragedy came a wave of strength. 2 weeks later, thousands more, black and white, rich and poor, young and old, joined the marchers. This time, they crossed the bridge safely, singing, "We shall overcome." Their bravery pushed Congress to act once again. Just months later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, securing the right to vote for all Americans. The dream was moving forward, step by step, bridge by bridge. For Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the victories were bittersweet. He had seen progress, laws passed, barriers broken, but he also saw poverty, violence, and hate that still lingered. He began speaking out not only for civil rights, but for economic justice and peace. He marched for the poor. He spoke against war. He reminded America that equality was not just about laws, it was about opportunity, dignity, and compassion. He said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." But on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King's voice was silenced by an assassin's bullet. He was only 39 years old. The world stopped again. Crowds gathered in sorrow, church bells rang, and from every corner of the country, people wept, not just for a man, but for a dream unfinished. But even in death, his message did not die. The seeds he had planted were already growing. After the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that followed, America continued to change. New leaders emerged, young men and women who had grown up during the movement, who had seen the marches on TV and wanted to build on them. Black Americans began winning elections, leading schools, and serving in government. By the 1970s, mayors, judges, and congressmen of color were helping shape a new political landscape. In classrooms, children read about Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Freedom Riders. They learned not just about segregation, but about courage, not just about injustice, but about perseverance. And slowly, generation by generation, the walls of racism began to crack. The civil rights movement didn't just change America, it inspired the entire world. In South Africa, where apartheid ruled, Nelson Mandela and others drew strength from America's story. In Europe, Asia, and Latin America, people fighting for their rights quoted King's speeches and carried his dream forward. It showed the world that justice could be won not by violence, but by unity, discipline, and love. That one voice, joined by thousands, could move mountains. The dream that began on a bus in Montgomery had become a global anthem for human dignity. History often remembers the leaders, the presidents, the preachers, the poets. But the Civil Rights Act was also built by ordinary people, by the teachers who taught children to read even when their schools had no books, by the mothers who walked to work every day during the bus boycott, by the farmers who donated a few dollars to help pay for court cases, by the students who sat down at lunch counters knowing they might be beaten or jailed. Their names may never appear in history books, but their courage changed the world, because every step, every march, every prayer, and every no whispered against injustice was a brick in the foundation of freedom. For the generations born after 1964, the world they entered was not perfect, but it was undeniably different. They grew up in schools that were open to all. They sat beside classmates of every race, learned from teachers of every background, and dreamed dreams that once would have been impossible. Black doctors treated white patients. White children learned about heroes who were black. Music, art, and sports became the spaces where people of all colors celebrated together. The change wasn't just legal, it was cultural, emotional, human. A new identity was forming, one that saw America not as divided by race, but united by shared ideals. Yet, even today, the work remains unfinished. The dream still calls for action in new forms for new generations. Discrimination didn't vanish, it evolved. Inequality still exists in schools and jobs and neighborhoods. Racism sometimes hides behind polite words or quiet systems rather than loud signs. But the Civil Rights Act remains a torch, a light to follow when the road grows dark. It reminds every generation that justice is not a gift, it's a duty. Dr. King once said, "The time is always right to do what is right." And that truth still echoes through every classroom, every protest, every voice raised for fairness, from racial justice to gender equality, from immigrant rights to freedom of speech. The movement lives on, not in history books, but in the hearts of people who refuse to give up. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not just a piece of paper, it was a promise, written with courage, sealed with sacrifice, and passed down through generations. It told the world that no matter how deep the pain of the past, humanity could rise above it, that laws could change and hearts could follow, that freedom was not a gift given, but a right earned. And above all, it proved something timeless, that the fight for justice is never over, but it is always worth it. Today, when a child walks into a classroom, when a family dines together at any restaurant they choose, when a woman or a man of any color becomes a leader, they are walking in the footsteps of those who marched before them. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not just about one moment in history. It was about the soul of a nation learning to live its own ideals. From the dark buses of Montgomery to the shining steps of the Lincoln Memorial, from the bridges of Selma to the halls of the White House, America had been reborn. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation by law, but it began something far greater, a movement of hearts. It reminded the world that change doesn't come from power alone, but from people Ordinary, brave, unyielding people who believe in fairness, who believe in love, who believe in the dream. And that dream still lives in every person who stands for justice, in every child who believes they are equal, and every hand extended across color and creed. Because equality is not a destination, it's a journey. And that journey continues every single day. This is the story of a law that changed a nation. The story of people who refuse to be silent. The story of how America, broken, divided, yet unafraid, took one great step toward its promise of freedom for all.